It's Monday, June 30th, 2014. I'm Rim.
I'm Scott.
And tonight we talk about profiling, as in performance, not racial.
Let's do this.
Now, there is actually precedent for talking about racial profiling in terms of computers.
Racist computers?
Type, did someone blink into Google image search, and you'll see what I mean. It's the sad truth of the way computer programmers do what they do and who most computer programmers are for consumer electronics.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least who the face models they use are. So, yeah, I refuse to talk about biking anecdotes for as long as possible because that's all we do. Every show Geeknights lately in the beginning is like, so I was biking and I saw someone do something stupid.
But all I did today was biking.
You were biking around and you were like, Internet, where should I bike in the city? And of course, you go where everyone tells you except me.
You told me to go. If I went there, I could have made it. I wouldn't be here doing this podcast right now because I'd still be on my way back.
Not that long of a ride.
And I wouldn't have gone to anyone else's places either. I maximized going to every place people asked. Went to all of them.
So, yeah, in the news, it's kind of a sad day. Google announced that they're killing Orkut, which surprised me.
Dun, dun, dun.
Because I thought they'd already killed Orkut, and I was just wrong.
I thought that it was still going strong, and it was just not used in this country.
Yeah, so apparently it is still going strong, and it's just not used in this country.
Then why are they killing it?
Probably because, now, this is purely, their statement was pretty straightforward. Quote, 10 years ago, Orkut was Google's first foray into social networking.
It was great.
Yeah. Built as a 20% project, blah, 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 blah. It basically shaped online life before people really knew what social networking was.
Mm-hmm.
Over the past decade, YouTube, Blogger, and Google Plus have taken off, which is already kind of funny that they said it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Google Plus is doing so well. With communities springing up in every corner of the world because the growth of these communities has outpaced Orkut's growth.
Orkut's not growing. It's just steady and large.
I get the impression that it was growing slowly, but...
Listen, I can have something with one user. Once it gets user number 2, that's 100% growth.
Yeah.
Orkut's huge and it gets 2 people. It didn't grow at all.
It's important to talk about Orkut a little bit, though, because one, this is something Google has been doing a lot, and you can't blame them because this is what
that's their strategies. More wood behind fewer arrows.
But also, all companies will do this, and you in your own life should probably do the same thing. If you got a bunch of buns in the oven and you remove 1 or 2 of those buns, those other buns get more oven. That's the worst analogy ever, but you get my point. The point is, companies will not bother with something, even if it's successful. You could argue that Orkut is still successful and useful and probably breaks even or makes money.
You figured they would just give it to someone like for a rescue mission like Delicious did or whatever. Like sell it off or something. Someone wants it. Some Brazilian business person can make do with that.
Yeah, you'd think that, but at the same time, it's already, as I learned just now, pretty tightly integrated into the rest of Google's stuff.
Well, everything Google does is tightly integrated with the rest of Google's stuff.
Yeah, but not 100% integrated. They're always like 88% integrated.
No, they whenever Google buys something, they move it onto their infrastructure and their
Eventually.
server farms as quickly as possible, and they make it where you're signing with Google.
So it was not until relatively recently, like in recent years, that they shifted a lot of Orkut stuff to be more with Google. Apparently, they did the redesign was in, 2009?
So 5 years ago.
That's not that long ago.
It's kind of long.
Yeah. So basically, Orkut was, for all intents and purposes, the first modern social network, and it really paved the way for what everyone else did later. I mean, when we were using this, there really wasn't Facebook. Like, everyone we knew used Orkut. At least everyone who was technological and young used Orkut.
Well, I mean, it was like the year like 03?
No, 04.
04?
It was 04, 05 is when we were using it strong, and then we stopped using it.
Right, it's like everyone was in college. We all used it. We didn't really Facebook then, even though we could have. And that was our thing. And then Brazilians came in, and then it wasn't our thing.
Orkut had a few fundamental flaws. It was lessons learned. One, it assumed that everyone in your social network was 100% trusted by you, and that nobody was a spammer or an asshole.
All right, well, this was in 04.
Yes, and it worked.
I'm sure it's different now.
It actually worked. I mean, you could just tweet. It was totally open. There was almost no restrictions on anything. So you could send a message and be like, yeah, I want this message to go to all my friends and all the friends of my friends, and that was never abused.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day, I got a message in Portuguese. And then, like 10 people I didn't know tried to add me as a friend, and their friending messages were in Portuguese. And then every group I was a member of, every single one, even the irresponsible Captain Tyler fan club, became inundated with Portuguese posts. And upon translating them, none of them were even talking about the topics of the groups. They were all just spammy, hey, follow me on Orkut messages.
Mm-hmm.
And then pretty much overnight, every English-speaking user of Orkut disappeared, and it became the primary social network of Brazil and a significant social network in India.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I learned a lot about Portuguese culture back then.
Spam everybody.
Yep, pretty much. So, if you use Orkut inexplicably,
Well, Brazilian Portuguese, not Portugal Portuguese.
they're pretty similar, if
Anyway.
not the same in most cases.
Mm.
Anyway, so if you somehow use Orkut, you should use Google Takeout to get your data off of it. If
What, you have data in there?
Well, this is a separate thing. I've noticed a lot of people, when they worry about leaving a social network or some sort of online system like Flickr or something, and they're like, oh my God, I have to leave this system. It's not enough time. What do I do with all the data I stored there? My answer is, why the fuck did you store any data there? That is a place to share, not store. They're separate things.
Exactly.
So this is the end of an era. It took 10 years for Orkut to become the biggest social network to dead. Let's see what happens to Facebook.
It was only the biggest for like a few minutes.
It was the biggest before there were social networks.
Sure. All right, other news. Another thing that we used back in years like 2004, fresh meat. It died. It died actually like 11 days ago, but
I guess it's not fresh anymore.
we haven't really done any shows since then. Yeah, fresh meat, for anyone who doesn't know, back in the day, before we had BitTorrents, right? And when if you wanted to download some open source softwares, your choices were A, SourceForge, right? B, but that was more like GitHub of its day, right? It wasn't, you downloaded stuff there, but not necessarily, not at the beginning anyway. B, if your distro had like package servers, you could use those. C, download like ISOs of the distro, and all the packages came on the ISO on the CD, and you installed from the CD.
Usually pretty out of date, and unless you were in a college, it took a long time to download that ISO.
And fresh meat. Fresh meat was the place to go to see when like open source. If you made an open source software, you released it there. You put your packages to download there. It was the thing. So now it is finally gone. For reals. It is a sad day, showing that other means of distributing software besides having an old-fashioned website where you went and searched and clicked, right? For Windows software, there were other websites like Two Cows.
Oh, yeah, all those sites before they basically... All those sites eventually just became nothing but malware distributors.
Yeah, download.com.
Yeah.
All those sites, this is basically the open source of those sites, and now... those sites died a long time ago. Now fresh meat is also dead. Rest in peace.
But anyway, things of the day. What's your thing of the day?
My thing of the day.
The best thing you've seen in the last day.
Let me open it up right now.
You forgot it already, didn't you?
Yes.
You forgot what your thing of the day was.
I remember it now because it just opened.
Okay.
So, right near us is a place called 5 Points. Not 6 points, not 4 points. 5 points.
5 points with a Z and an uppercase P.
Yeah, it's the number 5 inside a star, inside a circle, right? Also, light bulbs are their logo and shit.
It was an abandoned warehouse with awesome graffiti all over it.
And they basically let people graffiti all over the abandoned warehouse on purpose, and that's why it was crazy awesome. Some people were like, that's not real graffitis, because it's like everyone had like grids, like my thing goes here, your thing goes there, as opposed to just go wherever you want, which is whatever, cultural, whatever, graffiti people. They have their shit just like nerds have, right?
Yeah, they do.
But I don't care. There were awesome arts all over it. And if you rode the 7 train between Queensboro, Court Square, and, Hunters Point, you saw it. And it was amazing. And you could even go over there and look at it closely if you took the time. And then there was some sort of disputes, and the people who legitimately own the building, no dispute about that, wanted to sell it and make some crazy luxury apartments because New York, money, land, valuable. This thing's crazy huge. They were like, yeah, we're going to build a new building there. And everyone's like, no.
Big protests, all sorts of like rabble-rousing people
Right.
trying
And
to
they're
get
like,
it
we'll give
designated
you-
as a historical art site.
It's like, we'll let you have space in the building to keep doing graffiti. Cause
no, that's corporate, man.
we love graffitis. That's why we let you do it all these years. So in our new fancy building, we'll let you do some. No.
That's too corporate.
And then the jerk move, the building is still there. They went and just painted over everything.
What they
with
were doing,
white,
the reason they did that
and then
was
close the building.
to get the people, because basically the people who were doing the graffiti art up to that point started getting really troublesome in the area with lots of protests and breaking into the building, and they were filing all these lawsuits to like hold it off. So what they did is they destroyed all the art so that even if those people wanted to keep fighting, there's nothing left to fight for. And it worked. Basically, all the protesters dispersed, and that ended all debate.
Still a dick move.
Yeah, it was a completely dick move.
You still see around, like if you take the N train up to Astoria, there's like a 5 points keep the lights on graffiti, right, with the light bulbs on it. And you see that in a few other places. I think what they could have done, right, that it's like, okay, look, we don't, ideally you don't do anything here because this thing is totally awesome. Don't fuck it up. We hate you, right? But okay, you own this building and you're not making any money off of it. You're paying property tax.
Also,
there's
there's a severe housing shortage in New York City.
Yeah. But you could have just been like, all right, look, we'll make a new apartment building, but you can paint all the fuck over it and it'll be the awesomest apartment building ever. And that, I would have not had any complaints with them. And that would have been totally sweet, actually.
Yeah.
It could have been even bigger than 5 points. Anyway, so most of you, I imagine listening, have never seen 5 points like we have, having lived right around the fucking corner from it many times. So if you need to see it, how do you see it? I mean, it's sort of a three-dimensional thing. It's not really like, if the Mona Lisa gets burned, guess what? You'll know what it looks like. You'll be all right. If 5 points, when it gets demolished, already, you'll never know what it looks like. Except Google Maps or Google Maps, they took some sort of 3D images of it, and you can check it out in 3Ds like you're there looking out the train. Just like we did.
It's pretty cool.
As it was before it got painted over.
Now, obviously, it changed a lot, so you're getting one snapshot of it near the end, not
No, that's the time that I saw. I mean, I didn't see what it looked like in the 90s.
No, but I'm saying like a lot of those arts were
2000s.
changing regularly while we even lived here.
Yeah, sure. But, some of them were pretty, they stayed there for a while and such.
So I noticed we had a trend here where everything we've talked about in the show up to this point was about something dying.
Shadowgate show.
So
Dead.
I figured for my thing of the day, I would continue this trend because I discovered, as for whatever reason, YouTube decided to recommend this to me, saying, hey, here's a video you'd like to watch. It's the entire running length of the 1992 movie, The Lawnmower Man,
What does that have to do with
a.k.a.
death?
Flowers for Algernon plus ridiculously bad CG VR. This movie is infamous for being what it is. The reason I make it my thing of the day
What does it do with death?
is that lately the Oculus Rift has been getting a lot of attention, and Google
That is the biggest shit.
and Google did their cardboard thing, and VR, virtual reality, which is distinct from augmented reality,
Yeah.
is becoming a thing again. It's starting to become, regardless of the technical aspects of it, it's starting to enter the public lexicon again.
Come back.
In the 90s, like 92, 93,
It was big. It was
VR
bigger then than it is now.
VR was the biggest goddamn thing in the world. There were VR, like, laser tag things in malls everywhere. MagFest has some of those in the arcade occasionally. And there were TV shows and movies and VR, VR, VR. So I present to you three things. The Lawnmower Man, the pilot episode of a television show from that era called VR5,
Oh, God.
and VR Troopers. These three things collectively are the dream of virtual reality that was born in 1991 and died in 1993, and inexplicably a decade later,
2 decades later.
God, we're old. Inexplicably has
Math.
returned now that technology has finally caught up to the point that it's able to do what we expected it to do back then.
Kinda. Sort of. It's still a really giant, uncomfortable headset.
It's not that uncomfortable.
It's still not super
It is
comfortable.
way less uncomfortable than a Virtual Boy or that thing in the mall.
Yes, call me when it's as comfortable as like a pair of Oakleys.
So in the meta moment, the book club book is A Canticle for Leibowitz.
It's Jewish.
I read it a while ago. I'm just waiting for Scott to read it.
Yeah, it's been nice out. So
Yeah, how far did you get in the book?
I haven't read any more of it since I last read it.
So it's still about monks?
Yes.
It's about monks in a medieval society?
It's about monks in the desert.
Okay, it's not monks on spaceships yet then.
No. I'm waiting for that part.
And the most important thing we can talk about is that coming up July 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th is Kineticon.
Oh shit, son.
This con, seriously, we talk about it a lot, but
We can talk. Let's talk about some guests of the con this time.
Oh my
Who's
God,
on the guest list?
Guest. Let me pull up the featured guests of Kineticon 2014.
People that we would actually care about and want to see.
Scott will not know who most of these people are.
Okay, well, if you care about and want to see them, that also counts.
Alan Oppenheimer.
I don't know who that is.
Okay, Scott. He is recognized as the voice of many characters, often from Filmation in the 70s and 80s, such as Mighty Mouse, Ming the Merciless, The Overlord, Skeletor.
It's the voice of Skeletor. Oh my god! Why didn't you just say the voice of Skeletor is going to be there?
We have Noah Hathaway.
I don't know who that is either.
You don't know Noah Hathaway?
Is it the voice of He-Man?
No, look at this picture here. That's
I can't. It's someone with a horse.
someone with a horse. That's Atreyu, Scott,
Okay.
from the Neverending Story.
Yeah, I know who that is.
You didn't react when I said Atreyu.
I don't care about the never-ending story.
We have Ricky Simmons.
All right.
You don't know who that is either, do you?
No.
Voice of Gurr.
Oh. Okay.
We have Walter Jones,
All right.
the original Black Power Ranger.
Okay.
Yeah.
The American one.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you get me the original Japanese Kamen Rider, that would be fucking awesome. That guy's probably got mad stories, yo.
I'm going to link this page because it's actually really, really, really long, and more guests have appeared here since the last time I looked
The
at
guest
it.
I care about the most, Super Art Fight,
Super Art Fight.
is having in the final bout on the card, question mark, is going to battle. Oh my God, who the fuck is it?
I'm going to bet Banksy.
That would be... I don't even know what would happen if that happened. Kineticon would suddenly go from Hartford local news to world news.
And in terms of panels, I mean, we've got a belly dancing workshop.
Oh, yeah.
A workshop on how to make levels in Doom.
Oh, yes.
Getting into animation, the dreams and the nightmares. A
Mostly
sculpting
nightmares.
workshop.
Mm-hmm.
Yowie and you.
All right.
I guess that is.
I guess you need some yowies.
Something about ponies. Something about Hyrule. A whole Kineticon Kids Zone.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Takes up a whole room. We don't have to program.
The internet and gender politics.
Oh, gee, that's not a hot topic. Lately.
Anime directors you should know. Juggling 101. Women and anime. Unsettling Pokemon.
Spiritomb?
Closing ceremonies.
Mime?
Convention feedback.
Ooh, that's my favorite panel.
Seriously, Kineticon every year has been way better than the previous years. So Kineticon is rapidly going from a con to go to if you're in the area to a con you should travel for.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if nothing else, to highlight one thing, look at our YouTube channels, subscribe to them, like the videos, and watch the videos because we're actually making a lot of videos.
All my net videos are Netrunner videos.
All my videos are everything else that we do with our powers combined. So I'm in the middle of a lot of this at work, and Scott, as a proper developer, has a lot to say about it. But we've talked about aspects of performance and computers and how fast to make a computer and everything. We haven't talked about writing performance software because that's already a pretty broad topic. But how do you even know what your performance is?
Right. Let's say I write a Hello World program, and it's slow for some reason. When I run it, it takes like a minute to write Hello World. And I'm like, why the fuck is this taking a minute? Well, obviously, it's slow. But the program has a lot of moving parts in it, right? It could be slow when it's reading the program from the hard drive into the memory. It could be slow when it's executing the instructions in the program. It could be slow with the I.O. sending the output and input, accepting inputs to the program and sending the outputs to the monitor or the speakers or
It
whatever.
could be slow because it's poorly written and has a bunch of weird thread locking issues.
Yeah.
Because you wrote your multi-threaded hello world.
There are about 100 reasons your hello world could be slow in different places. So how do you, if you have like, say, a car and the car is not working, you can sort of use your ear and figure out which part of the car is not working. Or use logic and, the process of elimination. Like, okay, when I turn the key, something happens. So that means the ignition is at least doing something, but maybe the starter isn't any good.
But even then already, you say you use your ear, but that still requires specialized knowledge.
It does require specialized knowledge, but, I guess now computers have diagnostics things you plug in, right? But cars have them, not computers.
Well, computers also have them. They're called computers.
Sure. But like a Model T, it's like you can't plug a computer into a Model T and have
if
it tell
my
you
Model
what's
T
wrong
stopped
with it.
working, I'd open the hood and see if the one belt was still connected.
Quiet. I'm saying when you have a computer program, a thing that is entirely in software, and you're pretty sure all your hardware is working, and it's slow for some reason. And you need, if it's broken, you have debuggers that help you. But if it's slow, you need a profiler to basically look at all the different parts of the program, and it will tell you how long each part takes, and then you'll know which part is the slow part.
Now, even this is extra complicated because a lot of times, like for example, in my job, we're just finance. There's a lot of very high performance situations, but there's also sort of asynchronous aspects of these things that don't necessarily need to be high performance, but depending on what's in the sort of active workflow of a message versus what's asynchronous and how the threading model is, sometimes even if you run some sort of profiling against test data and everything looks great, and then you run the exact same code in a production environment and the performance profile is completely different. Testing this shit is actually really hard. And the worst part is, it's actually very difficult ahead of time to determine what the performance of something will be by any method other than experimentation.
Yep.
There's almost no way to say, well, I'm using MongoDB for this like storage aspect of it, and I'm using this component and this component and this threading model. Therefore, the latency per message will be 8 microseconds. Like that doesn't really happen in the kind of programming most of you will ever do.
It's like you could sit there and count like by hand how many assembly instructions are executed between point A and point B, but then you have to add in not just your program, but every assembly instruction the operating system executes. Oh, and the other things the computer is doing while that's happening that you don't even know about because the OS is giving control to other programs that are also running. And the network, who knows what the network situation is going to be? Network conditions are like weather.
Yeah.
Right? You don't know, right? When I did the profile and it worked great. Now it's coming in at like 10 minutes to do the same thing because YouTube's down. That's why.
I think the worst part about all this is that what I found really hard is when you find a performance problem in some software, let's say, and you believe that it's due to the hardware simply not being adequate, but you need to be able to prove that to the person you're about to tell that to.
Mm-hmm.
When you're like, yo, dog, it's your server, you need better hardware. One, they're going to ask you, how did you determine that?
Yep.
And two, they're going to ask you, what hardware would be adequate?
Mm-hmm.
And that's also really hard to figure out.
Right, like sometimes, the program might be slow in, say, the reading the program from the disk into the memory, right? Some I/O might be slow. So you can buy an SSD maybe if you don't have one already. But is it really the fact that you don't have an SSD? Or could the program be rewritten in such a way as where it would be fast enough on a magnetic drive and your program's just poorly written?
Like, here's one thing
and
I ran
you're using
into.
fast hardware to make up for your shitty job you did.
Here's something similar to that I actually ran into, and it was fascinating when we figured out what was going on. Basically, this relational store, well, non-relational store, one of those NoDB things we had going, because there's basically we needed gigantic multidimensional hash maps on the fly. So this is Java, and the process, when the thing started running to process messages and do its thing, would do some JIT, some just-in-time compilation.
Mm-hmm.
So the performance for the first N milliseconds would be pretty bad because there's a thread doing the just-in-time compilation.
Yep.
And then suddenly performance would get really good. But then you look at the profile over minutes and you see this huge deviation because you had all these outliers in like the first microsecond buckets before you get into the later profile. But then what do you do about that? Do you have it just in time already? Now you got to really rework your application. Do you prime it with something, with fake data at a time? Do you use a different framework? Do you maybe not use Java?
Yeah, so what a profiling tool usually does is you sort of give it your program, and usually you need a different profiling tool based on what language you're using or what framework you're using.
Yeah,
or,
like I'll use, like if I'm doing something, I'll use something like JVisual VM.
Yeah. I don't really, I guess the Django debug toolbar sort of does, what all I need in it. It tells you like it shows you every SQL query you did and how long each one took.
Yep.
And then it shows you basically every Python instruction and how long it took, right? So you know like, aha, this took a long in the database and not so long in any other area.
Though that usually doesn't tell you why it took so long. It just tells you that that's what took so long.
Yep.
So it's not I've noticed that a lot of developers know how to use their profiling tool, but don't know much about OSs.
Right. So let's say it tells you that database query took a whole minute, and you're like, well, that's a problem, and I know exactly what query it is. So I need to change this query to make it faster. Yes, that is what you need to do. What's slow about this query?
Yep. Select star from where.
On.
Using the esoteric merges.
Sure.
But I've noticed that like programmers will only know the programmer side, and then the system administrators are almost never developers. So they have no idea about like threading or anything. They just know about like the OS itself on a fundamental level. And then you have these like functional programmers who usually write very low-level applications in assembly or C++ or Objective-C.
That's not functional.
Well, as
functional programming is Lisp and shit.
Well, as in they'll write the core logic of performance systems around which people write their bigger things.
Mm-hmm.
And those guys are usually the only people who can actually say something like, your application is running slow because you do your threads like this, and hyperthreading is enabled, and this particular thing is happening, and you didn't use core affinity.
Yep, the kind of people who write like the Linux kernel or device drivers and other low-level programs are the only people who actually mostly know any shits about actual computer performance in software. Pretty much anyone else doesn't know. All the people who program at like high-level languages, like they don't know. They just write, and all the stuff that actually matters for performance is completely hidden from them. Like, you'll see a lot of questions in Stack Overflow, like, okay, here's two different ways to write this, basically the same thing in Python. And it's like, they give me the same result, but this one took twice as long. Why? And then the Stack Overflow answer is from one of those guys who can write C and looks at the assembly code output of both of those Python things and is like, this is why. And you go, oh. But the thing is, you don't know. You have to read that and go, oh, that guy can figure it out. He can read the assembly and know what it's saying and know why it's slower. And that is a person you need to pay a lot of money if you care about your program being fast.
Now, the one thing you cannot do is try to rely on benchmarks to figure out what your performance will be. Benchmarks are the most ridiculously synthetic and increasingly useless metrics of computer performance in the world.
Right. Well, a benchmark for a computer is, we'll stick with our the most used analogy ever, the car, right? It's like a dynamometer where you put it on the thing and you just, right? And it's like, okay, you've told me how much the engine can spin the tire. It doesn't tell you anything about the downforce and the aerodynamics or any of the other thing, right? The friction on the pavement or different materials of the road or the driver or anything like that. All it tells you is pretty much how much the engine can spin when you put fuel in it.
So what advice should we give people? Like, how do you do this? Because a lot of you are probably, a lot of our listeners on the Monday shows are recently out of college or are going to college soon or recently young in their careers, young in their jobs. How can you be better at this than everybody? Because most people suck at this.
Well, I mean, first of all, you might not need to be better at it, or you might not need to know it at all. Most software these days, right, doesn't really need to be performance optimized. You can write a poorly written iPhone app, and it'll be so fast on an iPhone, even if it's poorly written. Sure, it could be faster, but it's already so fast, no one will ever complain about it being slow or care. So
they might complain about you draining their battery, though.
That's different than performance is speed, but yeah, battery usage is a problem.
That is for the user. I'm a product manager. I speak for the user. As far as the user is concerned, battery use is performance.
It's an aspect, but performance usually just refers to speed.
Yeah, well, what I'm getting at there is that
that's not important.
As I've kind of shifted my career away from tech and more toward design and all these things, as a product manager, I've realized increasingly that my job is to advocate for the user. Yeah. And when you're doing performance testing, the only thing that matters is what is your deliverable and are you achieving it?
But a performance tool isn't going to tell you anything about battery. You need different things. That's like
a battery performance tool, perhaps.
I don't know. Your profiler wouldn't tell you anything about your battery, right? That's like a separate thing to check for, right? At least in mobile apps specifically, especially, right? But yeah, no one will care if your thing doesn't use a lot of battery and is, reasonably fast. So
there we go.
Spending time rewriting it to be faster is a whole lot of effort for not a lot of result. But
for example, could you make it feel faster by simply making the UI snappier and more responsive, even if the actual things it's doing take longer?
Yep. But at the same time, let's say you make a fancy 3D game. If you make it, people will notice if it's slow and shitty. And you do need to make it faster, and it's going to take a lot of work, but you have to do it anyway.
In fact, I remember there was a map for Action Quake 2. I think it was based on the Hoover Dam. It was an awesome map, but people would complain that it had really bad
CS Thunder?
speed. But what? No. Scott, CS Thunder is back. I've been playing Counter-Strike on it regularly.
I don't play Counter-Strike.
CS Thunder is there, Scott. You can just play on it right now.
And you just get killed.
It's awesome. You should play with the listeners. Most of them really suck. You'd be fine. You'd be in like the top 5 players against the listener.
Great. Get more listeners to play.
So, that map, people would complain about the R speeds because if you looked toward the dam and your computer was not really fast, your FPS would drop to like 1 per second.
Well, that's why all the Quake games were in and Doom even, and Wolfenstein were in these tight tunnel areas. They didn't have big open rooms because whenever you in a big open room, suddenly you see a bunch of shit at once. So the game has to render a bunch of shit at once and shit slows down. Or when there's a lot of bad guys on the screen at once, everything slows down. The game was designed in such a way like, okay, you're looking at like 2 bad guys in a tiny hallway. We can handle that. Oh, you're looking at like a giant open arena with 100 bad guys in it. My God.
So my advice is, 1, understand more than just the basics about how servers work and how I/O works. You should, if you figure out that I/O is the problem, you should understand what that means and what you could do about it on the server. You should understand how to use the IO stats command then to figure out exactly what's going on with the IO. Because sure, like Scott said, your SQL query is slow. Why? How you profile your MySQL server? Well, 1, it's MySQL. That's why it's slow.
Well, no, I mean, number 1, it could be that the database, you didn't put indexes and shit on it that you need to make that query faster.
Yep.
2, it could be just a really shittily written query. 3, you might need to readjust your database schemas because they're really bad.
4, you might not have a lot of RAM and it swaps to actually pull the database stuff into memory.
You might be selecting so much amounts of data in that query that even though the query processes quickly, it has to read all that data from disk. Oh, and by the way, it's so much data, it takes a long, and your database server is on a separate computer. Oh, it has to send all that data over the network to the web server. Oh, and that takes forever. I noticed that one is one that happens a lot because what happens is people, when they're developing a web application, the database server is on the same machine as the web server.
Oh, yeah,
so
they're completely open, no security, locally running MySQL.
Exactly. So no matter how much data you query, it's just basically putting that data directly into the RAM, right? Or just passing it within the computer to the other process. And it's ridiculously fast over the internal socket or whatever. But as soon as you move the database server to another computer, that SQL query that selects like 100 megabytes worth of rows, that you have to wait for basically, how long does it take you to download a 100 megabyte file over the LAN? That's how long it's going to take for that query to execute.
Oh, and by the way, most network cards consume CPU resources to go through the stack.
Oh, that's a shame.
Oh. There's probably other I/O going on in the network cards.
And there's other queries going on the database server.
So you need to understand the server enough to be able to say, oh, the problem is my network card is consuming too much CPU. I should get, some sort of FPGA network card, like one of those solar flare things.
Almost no one needs that.
I need that, but I'm doing packet capture.
You're almost no one.
Well, I'm doing packet capture, so I actually have the one use case for that's necessary.
Sure.
Or you should understand RAM and swapping, like page faults and all those things. Know what those things are.
Yeah, a lot of people are like, my computer's slow, I gotta buy more RAM. My computer's still slow. Maybe because RAM wasn't the fucking problem.
Yeah, I mean, I've only got 12 gigs of RAM in my PC right here, and I'm using about 6 of it, and 5 of that is cache.
Right, so if you increased his RAM It wouldn't make any difference whatsoever.
Like when I render a video for Geeknights, it uses about 8 or 9 gigs of RAM, but all 8 of my cores are maxed the fuck out the entire time.
Which tells you that adding more CPU would help that go faster, but adding more RAM would not.
And adding faster disks would also likely not improve my performance in any measurable way.
No, not at all.
Yeah, because the CPU is pulling, it's got plenty of data, it's just processing it as fast as it can.
The same way, if you're playing like a 3D video game, and when you click to start the game, it takes a long time before the level shows up. That's because it's taking a long time usually loading textures from your disk into the memory. And it usually
the video card's memory, not your system's memory.
That's the thing. So if your video card runs out of memory, it's going to use the system memory, which is ridiculously fast, but not as ridiculously fast as video card memory. And if it can't fit all the textures in both those places combined, it's going to read them from the disk while you're playing in the level, or not have textures, and it's going to be bad. So how do you fix that? Number 1, SSDs to load the textures faster, and 2, video card with more video memory.
Yep. Now, SSDs are expensive, so if you're doing server-y type stuff, as much as it's awesome to get like a RAID 10 of just a bunch of SSDs, that could cost tens of thousands of dollars.
But in the long run, it might actually save you money. You have to do a lot of math to figure out the optimal things to buy.
I'd argue that you can't do the math with, usually you can get away with just getting 15,000 RPM drives instead. Put them on a fucking RAID 1 or RAID 0 if you have to.
Maybe.
Just for pure performance.
Maybe.
Yeah. But really,
and then they crash, and you buy a new one, and suddenly you're approaching the cost of the SSDs.
Yeah, except no, you're not. That's the thing. But that you have to, if you are going to do anything with performance profiling, you need to understand programming, profilers, the application itself, like what it's doing, and systems on a much deeper level than the superficial knowledge that most other programmers and IT people need to know.
I mean, if you just know one area, you can make your area faster and then leave it up to the other people to, if their stuff is slow, it's like, well, look, I've already done everything I can do with, I'm the system administrator. I tune the OS with all configuration still slow, it's all you.
Yeah, but even then, those OS options are usually voodoo.
Yes.
Most software companies, when they say set these kernel options, that's not because of math. That's because they did some performance testing on like one set of reference hardware. Those are the best options, and they just stick them in their documentation.
You're running a web server. How many concurrent HTTP requests do you want to allow?
Yeah.
How many how many Apache processes do you want to have simultaneously running?
How the fuck do you even figure that out?
Is more better? Less? How often do you want them to like reset?
So beyond all that, you need to approach this with a scientific mind. You need to understand statistics as well. So if you run a profile, like say you have a messaging bus, like some sort of middleware thing. So you're sending messages between multiple applications. So you look at your message rates and then you analyze it. Like how long did it take between this process sending the message and this other thing getting the message? And then you need to understand things like standard deviations. Like what is the standard deviation of your data? What is the shape of the latency of your processing pipeline? Is it fast at first and gets slower as time goes on? That's really different from if it's slow at first and gets faster as time goes on. Or super jittery, meaning that maybe your Java garbage collector is going crazy or something. Garbage collection. Every now and then I remember that I deal mostly with Java these days. Garbage collection can be a stop the world event, and it's not pleasant when you watch you see like this latency curve that's nice and smooth, and then suddenly there's like 10 outliers that are 2 to 5 orders of magnitude beyond the rest. But even then, what does that mean? If you don't know statistics, that doesn't mean anything to you. This has been Geeknights with Rim and Scott. Special thanks to DJ Pretzel for the opening music, Kat Lee for web design, and Brando K for the logos.
Be sure to visit our website at frontrowcrew.com for show notes, discussion, news, and more.
Remember, Geeknights is not 1, but 4 different shows. Sci-Tech Mondays, Gaming Tuesdays, Anime Comic Wednesdays, and Indiscriminate Thursdays.
Geeknights is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license. Geeknights is recorded live with no studio and no audience. But unlike those other late shows, it's actually recorded at night.
Google Plus is doing so well. with communities springing up in every corner of the world because the growth of these communities has outpaced Orkut's growth.
Orkut's not growing; it's just steady and large.
I get the impression that it was growing slowly, but
Listen, I can have something with one user. Once it gets user number 2, that's 100% growth.
yeah,
Orkut's huge and gets 2 people. It didn't grow at all.
it's important to talk about Orkut a little bit though, because one, this is something Google has been doing a lot, and you can't blame them because this is what
That's their strategies. More wood behind fewer arrows.
But also, all companies will do this, and you in your own life should probably do the same thing. If you got a bunch of buns in the oven and you remove 1 or 2 of those buns, those other buns get more oven. That's the worst analogy ever, but you get my point. The point is, companies will not bother with something, even if it's successful. You could argue that Orkut is still successful and useful and probably breaks even or makes money.
You figured they would just give it to someone, like, for a rescue mission like Delicious did or whatever. Like, sell it off or something. Someone wants it. Some Brazilian...
You go where everyone tells you, except me.
You told me to go. If I went there, I could have made it. I wouldn't be here doing this podcast right now because I'd still be on my way back.
Not that long of a ride.
And I wouldn't have gone to anyone else's places either. I maximized going to every place people asked. Went to all of them.
So, yeah, in the news, it's kind of a sad day. Google announced that they're killing Orkut, which surprised me.
Dun, dun, dun.
Because I thought they'd already killed Orkut, and I was just wrong.
I thought that it was still going strong, and it was just not used in this country.
Yeah, so apparently it is still going strong, and it's just not used in this country.
Then why are they killing it?
Probably because now this is purely, their statement was pretty straightforward. Quote, 10 years ago, Orkut was Google's first foray into social networking.
It was great.
Yeah. Built as a 20% project, blah, 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 blah. But it basically shaped online life before people really knew what social networking was.
Mm-hmm.
Over the past decade, YouTube, Blogger, and Google Plus have taken off, which is already kind of funny that they said it that way. It's Monday, June 30th, 2014. I'm Rim.
I'm Scott.
And tonight we talk about profiling, as in performance, not racial.
Let's do this.
Now, there is actually precedent for talking about racial profiling in terms of computers.
Racist computers?
Type "did someone blink" into Google image search, and you'll see what I mean. It's the sad truth of the way computer programmers do what they do and who most computer programmers are for consumer electronics.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least who the face models they use are.
Mm.
So, yeah, I refuse to talk about biking anecdotes for as long as possible because that's all we do. Every show Geeknights lately in the beginning is like, so I was biking and I saw someone do something stupid.
But all I did today was biking.
You were biking around and you were like, internet, where should I bike in the city? And of course,
business person can make do with that.
Yeah, you'd think that. But at the same time, it's already, as I learned just now, pretty tightly integrated into the rest of Google's stuff.
Well, everything Google does is tightly integrated with the rest of Google's stuff.
Yeah, but not 100% integrated. They're always like 88% integrated.
No, they whenever Google buys something, they move it onto their infrastructure and their
Eventually.
server farms as quickly as possible, and they make it where you sign in with Google.
So it was not until relatively recently, like in recent years, that they shifted a lot of Orkut stuff to be more with Google. Apparently, they did the redesign was in, 2009?
So 5 years ago.
That's not that long ago.
It's kind of long.
Yeah. So basically, Orkut was, for all intents and purposes, the first modern social network, and it really paved someone who was technological and young used Orkut.
Well, I mean, it was like the year 03,
No, 04.
04.
It was 04, 05 is when we were using it strong, and then we stopped using it.
Right. It's like everyone was in college. We all used it. We didn't really Facebook then, even though we could have. And that was our thing. And then Brazilians came in, and then it wasn't our thing.
Orkut had a few fundamental flaws. It was lessons learned. One, it assumed that everyone in your social network was 100% trusted by you, and that nobody was a spammer or an asshole.
All right, well, this was in 04.
Yes, and it worked.
I'm sure it's different now.
It actually worked. I mean, you could just tweet. It was totally open. There was almost no restrictions on anything. So you could send a message and be like, yeah, I want this message to go to all my friends and all the friends of my friends. And that was never abused.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day, I got a message in Portuguese. And then, like 10 people I didn't know tried to add me as a friend, and their friending messages were in Portuguese. And then every became inundated with Portuguese posts. And upon translating them, none of